Hey everyone, welcome to another deep dive. We're going to be talking about classification today, and we're going to try to make this relevant to you guys in Mr. Martin's IB biology class. So you're probably learning about kingdoms and phylum and all that stuff.
Right.
But we're going to go a little bit deeper today. We're going to look at two main ideas. One is how the traditional ways of classifying organisms have some serious limitations. And then we're going to look at this really cool approach called cladistics. It basically uses evolutionary relationships like a family tree to group organisms together.
Yeah, it's like detective work, really. Trying to uncover the connections between all living things.
Exactly. So let's start with this first idea about the problems with traditional classification. The sources we looked at pointed out this thing called inherent bias. It's basically like we're trying to fit this incredible diversity of life into these neat little boxes, just based on what we think is important.
Yeah. It's a huge paradigm shift in science, moving away from just what we can observe, and instead trying to understand the deeper relationships.
Right. And then there's this whole other issue of intergression, where different species can actually interbreed and create hybrids.
Like the coyote-wolf example in the article.
Yeah, that one really blew my mind.
Yeah.
So where do you even put a creature that's like 75% wolf and 25% coyote in the old system? It just doesn't work.
Exactly. It highlights the limitations of trying to fit everything into these fixed categories.
Okay, so if the traditional way of classifying life is kind of like our first suspect in this detective story, who's the new detective on the scene?
Well, that would be cladistics.
Yeah.
It's all about looking at evolutionary relationships, figuring out how recently organisms shared a common ancestor.
Oh, so it's like building a family tree for all life on Earth.
Pretty much. And we can use DNA and protein analysis to do that, so we're not just relying on what things look like anymore.
So we're going deeper, looking at their genetic code. It's like having a biological magnifying glass to help us solve the mystery.
Exactly. It's a much more accurate way to see how things are related.
This is already blowing my mind, and we're just getting started. One of the sources even mentioned this molecular clock thing. It sounds like scientists are using DNA mutations to estimate when species split off from each other, like tracing footprints back in time.
Yeah, it's a fascinating concept, but it's not perfect. You see, mutation rates can vary, so it's more of an estimation than an exact science.
But even with those challenges, the molecular clock has given us so much insight into evolutionary history. Wow, so we've got this new detective, new tools, and a whole new way of looking at the evidence. I'm already hooked on this story. But how do we actually visualize all these relationships? What do we do with all this new information?
Well, that's where cladograms come in. They're like maps of the tree of life. They show us how different species are related to each other based on their shared ancestry.
Okay, so I'm picturing this giant family reunion, but for all living things, with branches and connections showing who's a distant cousin and who's a close relative. But with millions of species on Earth, things must get pretty complicated. How do we even begin to make sense of it all?
Yeah, so we're looking at these cladograms, these maps of the tree of life, but I'm guessing they're not just like static pictures, are they?
Right, they're not just pretty pictures. There's a whole language we need to understand to read these maps.
Okay, so break it down for me. What are we looking at here?
Well, you'll see terms like root nodes and terminal branches.
All right, so let's start with the root. What's that all about?
So if you imagine a real tree, the root is like the base. It represents that very first common ancestor way back in time.
Got it. So it's like the origin point for all the organisms on that cladogram.
Exactly. And then as you move up the tree, you'll see points where it branches off. Those are called nodes.
So each node is like a fork in the road where one lineage goes one way and another goes another way.
Precisely. And at the very tips of those branches, you have the terminal branches. And those represent the specific species we're looking at.
Right. It could be a single species or a whole group of organisms that share a common ancestor.
Okay, so we've got our root, our nodes, and our branches. It's starting to make sense. But it's not just about seeing who's related to who. It's also about understanding when those relationships branched off.
Exactly. As you move from the root towards those terminal branches, you're moving forward in time.
So it's like a history book of life laid out right there in front of us.
You got it. And cladograms can also help us figure out which traits are primitive and which are derived.
Okay, so primitive traits are the ones that have been passed down from way back.
Right, those are the traits that were present in that early ancestor at the root of the tree.
And derived traits are the newer ones.
Exactly. Those traits appeared later in the evolutionary timeline.
So by looking at these traits on a cladogram, we can trace how features evolved over time.
And that helps us understand how we got the diversity we see today.
It's like solving a puzzle, seeing how each piece fits into the big picture of evolution.
That's a great analogy. And speaking of puzzles, remember that example in the article about the figwort family?
Oh, yeah, the one where scientists had to completely rethink how those plants were classified.
Yeah, they used to be grouped together based on what they looked like.
But then DNA analysis came along and revealed a whole different story, right?
It sure did. It turned out that some of the similarities were just due to convergent evolution.
Meaning they evolved similar traits because they lived in similar environments, but they weren't actually closely related.
Exactly. It was a classic case of looks being deceiving.
So the figwort family was basically playing dress-up, fooling scientists for centuries.
You could say that, and it just goes to show how powerful cladistics can be. It helps us see past those superficial similarities and get to the real evolutionary relationships.
It's a good reminder that science is always changing and evolving. We're always learning new things, and sometimes we have to rewrite the textbooks.
Absolutely. And speaking of rewriting textbooks, this brings us to another major shift in our understanding of life. The three domains.
Bacteria, archaea, and eukarya. That's like biology 101. What makes this three-domain system such a game changer? So it's cladistics and this DNA analysis that kind of blew the old system out of the water.
Yeah, it really shook things up.
Because before that, I mean, looking under a microscope, archaea kind of look like bacteria, right?
They do. They really do. So it makes sense that scientists would group them together.
But then we get this new tool, this DNA analysis.
And it's like, whoa, hold on. These archaeas are actually way more closely related to us, to the eukaryotes.
So instead of two main branches of life, we suddenly have three. It's like discovering a whole new continent.
Exactly. It completely changed our understanding of life's diversity.
That's wild. And speaking of archaea, the article mentioned these extremophiles. What's the deal with those guys?
Oh, yeah, the extremophiles. They're like the superheroes of the microbial world. They can survive in the craziest places.
Like where? Give me some examples.
Okay, picture this super salty lakes, like the Dead Sea,
Okay.
boiling hot springs,
And
even those volcanic vents on the ocean floor.
no way.
Yeah.
Most things would just die instantly in those places.
Right, but not extremophiles. They've adapted to thrive in these super harsh environments.
It just shows you how resilient life can be. I mean, if they can survive in those conditions, who knows what else is out there?
Exactly, and that's what makes this whole field so exciting. There's still so much to discover.
Yeah, one of the sources even said that cladistics is a work in progress.
We're learning new things all the time.
So the case isn't closed yet. There are still mysteries to solve.
Oh, absolutely. As we find new species and get more DNA data, we're going to have to keep refining our understanding of the tree of life.
So it's not just a static picture. It's more like this living, breathing thing that's constantly changing and growing as we learn more.
I like that analogy.
And this one quote from the article really stuck with me. It asks, if we keep discovering new species and new information about DNA, how might our understanding of classification and the tree of life change in the future?
I think that's a great question for everyone in Mr. Martin's class to think about.
Oh.
It really highlights that science is a process of discovery. We don't have all the answers, but we're constantly asking questions and searching for new evidence.
And who knows, maybe some of you listening right now will be the ones to make those next big discoveries about the tree of life.
I hope so. That's what makes biology so fascinating.
Well, I think that about wraps up our deep dive into the world of classification and cladistics. We've gone from relying on what we see with our own eyes to unraveling the secrets hidden in DNA.
All in pursuit of understanding how all life on Earth is connected.
We've seen the limitations of the old ways of classifying life, explored the power of cladistics, and discovered that the tree of life is far more complex and amazing than we ever imagined.
It's a pretty incredible story, don't you think?
Totally. So to everyone in Mr. Martin's class, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and thanks for joining us on this deep dive.